Adolf Hitler had sought close ties with Benito Mussolini, Italy's fascist dictator, from the moment he came to power in 1933. Mussolini and Hitler were both obsessed with the desire for empires that would bring glory to their respective countries and to themselves. For Mussolini, glory lay in Africa. By the outbreak of war in 1939, the Italian leader had an impressive army of some 1 million men in North Africa, and once he had formally declared his allegiance to Germany and declared war on Britain on the 10th of June 1940, these became a threat to the 36,000 British troops stationed in Egypt. In an initial failed attempt to become a partner the equal of Germany in the Axis alliance, Mussolini ordered his troops towards the British positions in Egypt in September 1940. Mussolini, feeling secure in the shadow of Hitler's apparent invincibility, never dreamt that the war between Britain and Italy would culminate in his own death less than 5 years later. The Italians were driven back across the desert, suffering heavy losses, to Tobruk in Libya, which the British captured in January 1941. Hitler was forced to bail out his inept partner by sending his own forces into northern Africa. It was another humiliating defeat for the boastful Mussolini, as he had already failed in an attempt to invade southern France, even as the Germans swept over the north of the country. He hoped to compensate in some measure for these embarrassing mishaps by capturing Greece. He declared war on Greece in October 1940, and Italian troops were soon in action over the mountainous terrain in the north of the country. Italy and Britain clashed in another theatre of war, the Mediterranean. The Royal Navy was trying to keep the sea lanes free for the British North African forces being supplied from Malta, from where Winston Churchill hoped his troops would be able to assist Greece. The Italians needed to supply their forces in Africa too, and the British bases on Malta were a continuing menace to the Italian fleet. Yet despite their aircraft carriers, the Italians were unable to send any messages of success back to Il Duce, as Mussolini liked to be known. Attacks on Malta brought no results, and the British continued to decimate the Italian convoys. Axis bombers made 24 raids on the island. Not even these could dislodge the British from their vital stronghold. In 1943, an historic meeting took place that was later recognized as a turning point in the war. The Casablanca Conference, which lasted from the 14th to the 24th of January. Winston Churchill and Franklin D. Roosevelt met to discuss the future course of the war effort. Joseph Stalin was unable to attend because the battle for Stalingrad was still in its final weeks, and the war in Russia was at a dangerous point, with Moscow and Leningrad under threat. With this perilous situation in mind, they turned their deliberations to Italy and came to the conclusion that an invasion of Italy would be necessary to oust Mussolini from power and end the Italian alliance with Hitler. The place eventually chosen for the first phase of the invasion was the island of Sicily. After the defeat of the German and Italian armies in North Africa, Italy was the next obvious stopping-off point for the Allies, so it was necessary to keep the Germans in the dark about where any landing might take place. Remarkably, Allied High Command was able to do so. Dwight D. Eisenhower was named as supreme commander of the operation that was known as Operation Husky. General Bernard Montgomery was in command of the British 8th Army, with General George S. Patton in command of the American 7th Army. The man in charge of the German forces on Sicily was Field Marshal Albert Kesselring. He had been made deputy commander of the Italian forces under Mussolini in November 1942. At his disposal were some 300,000 men, although only 30,000 of those were Wehrmacht soldiers. The island of Malta, over which the British had managed to keep control despite constant and merciless attacks by the Germans and Italians, was now the starting point for the Allied convoys. On the 9th of July 1943, 2,590 ships set their course for Sicily, in one of the largest combined operations of the war. Far from being an easy victory, the fighting would last for 38 days. The next day, the 10th of July, the British 8th Army was on the Sicilian beaches at 5 landing points, with the American 7th Army attacking on 3. They were the first of over 500,000 men that would arrive on the island within the next month. Heavy naval fire was especially effective in protecting the landings, whilst overhead, paratroopers and gliders were moving inland. Whilst the high winds caused the paratroopers to become scattered, the landings met with more success. There was, in fact, little opposition, and the troops began to fight their way inland, capturing towns and villages as they went over the next 5 days. Only in the center of the American front did the fighting inflate into a dangerous situation. Axis planes from the mainland made the congestion on the beaches even worse. Axis tanks were brought up to the front lines. The situation over the next days was on a knife edge. The less experienced American troops became so anxious about air raids that Allied transport planes were accidentally hit by ground fire. Montgomery's progress had been stalled by ferocious defending from Kesselring and the most mountainous terrain on the island. Kesselring had also decided that Messina was going to be the place where the Allies were to be stopped. A series of strongholds had been set up. Yet unknown to the Italian general Guzzoni, Adolf Hitler had decided that the island was to be evacuated. As the Americans moved towards them from the west, with the British attacking in the east, the Germans and Italians defended with tenacious ferocity. The fighting closed in on Messina. It had been hoped in London and New York that the Italian campaign would cause the Italians to rise up against Mussolini. The news from Rome on the 25th of July still took the Allies by surprise. The invasion of Sicily had started a crisis in an already divided Italian government. Hitler and Mussolini had met in northern Italy on the 19th to discuss the invasion. As they did so, American bombers were targeting Rome. As they turned away following the raid, some 2,000 people had been killed. The Italian king, Victor Emmanuel III, had Mussolini arrested on July the 25th. He was replaced by the Army Chief of Staff, Marshal Pietro Badoglio. Negotiations with the Allies were opened. Italy had no more appetite for the adventures of Hitler and his puppet Mussolini. Hitler needed to act quickly, and he sent for Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, who had just arrived in Greece to take command there. His instructions were to assemble troops in the Alps in readiness for a possible invasion of Italy. On the 29th, Hitler discussed with Otto Skorzenny the possibility of rescuing Mussolini from imprisonment. Skorzenny took the risk and commanded an airborne force which made a daring raid on the hotel where Mussolini was being held on September the 13th. The freed dictator was flown out of the country. He would have been well advised to remain abroad, but he returned to set up a short-lived fascist republic in northern Italy, immediately executing his opponents. The order for the German invasion of northern Italy was given by Rommel on the 30th. The Italians, still on the side of the Axis, were infuriated, but fobbed off with excuses. As August rolled into September, Rommel had established 8 German divisions inside Italy. 2 divisions were stationed near Rome, and if necessary, instructed to disarm the Italian troops in the city. The mountainous nature of much of Italy proved to be a greater problem for the Allies than anticipated. Dissected by rivers, it was ideal country for defense. The Germans knew perfectly how to make the best of the advantages they held in the rugged hilltops. The advancing British and American troops were made to pay the price for invasion with every step they made, something the Americans had always feared. The German build-up from the north of Italy continued, with crack SS panzer units being ordered there from Russia, whilst the Allies planned and prepared before embarking on the invasion of the Italian mainland. The new Italian government finally concluded an armistice with the Allies on September the 3rd. It was kept secret until the principal invasion forces had landed on the Italian mainland. The operation was scheduled for September the 8th. On the same day the armistice was signed, Montgomery's 8th Army was crossing the Straits of Messina. They encountered practically no resistance either then or in the days that followed. The British also landed at Taranto and began to move northwards along the eastern side of Italy and towards Salerno, on the west coast of the mainland. Tenacious German rearguard actions and Montgomery's customary caution meant that progress towards Salerno was slow. Operation Avalanche got underway on the 8th of September 1943. The Americans had heard the good news from Rome, which put them in the wrong frame of mind for a battle. They assumed that the Italian war was now over, and that there would be little, if any, fighting. They were in a celebratory mood. A tragic mistake. The Germans had no such illusions. They knew the attack was coming, and the Luftwaffe were in the skies as the Allied transports and destroyers arrived off the coast. On the 9th, the landings began. The American 5th Army to the south, commanded by Lieutenant General Mark Clark. The British had been assigned the northern sector. The landings almost turned into one of the greatest catastrophes of the war. Clark landed his forces on a 35-mile front, much too wide to enable the disparate units to support one another. There was heavy defensive fire from the very beginning along all principal landing sites. German machine guns, sighted in dominant positions on the surrounding hills, opened up, firing at a rate of over 1,000 rounds a minute. Only naval bombardments were able to take the sting from the worst of the panzer attacks. Nonetheless, by the end of the day, the Allies had not been able to close a 7-mile gap between their sectors, and many objectives had not been captured. In contrast, the 10th of September was quieter on the American beaches. The panzers had been regrouped and sent northwards to combat the British threat, perceived as being the greater. The British push towards Naples was strangled. Kesselring was forced to wait for reinforcements, and his plans were badly affected. He could not apply sufficient pressure to the bridgeheads, fortunately for the Allies. The Germans were still able to send in panzer divisions to prevent an Allied breakout, the panzers remained unscathed by American bazookas, and the American death toll rose unremittingly. In the British sector to the north, the conflict threw the combatants into street fighting in one of the most intense conflicts of the Salerno invasion. Mass artillery on both sides brought terrible death and destruction, with positions continually changing hands. Kesselring knew that he was running out of time and had to force the situation as soon as possible to his advantage. Allied reinforcements were now arriving. He chose the 15th of September for a full-scale onslaught against the Allied lines. In the center of the beachhead was a weak link, poorly manned. General Wietinghoff sent his panzers and infantry head-on into this sector. The town of Persano was hit by the most concentrated Wehrmacht attack of the entire campaign. The warning came as a German artillery bombardment covered the Allied lines. Clark had ordered in over 2,000 paratroopers, who now dropped into the battle areas and went straight into action, giving renewed vigor to the Allied effort. A battle of attrition for the Germans began as the panzers continued to pour fire across the lines. Even so, at one stage the outcome was so unsure that General Clark drew up plans for an evacuation of the beaches. But as so often, naval ships with their devastating firepower turned the tide in the Allies' favor. The Allies began to turn up the pressure on the German troops. The Air Force was making its presence felt, and Kesselring could no longer maintain the scale of the attack. The Wehrmacht was sustaining heavy losses. On the 17th of September, Kesselring ordered the withdrawal of his forces to the Gustav Line, a formidable defensive strap strung across the narrowest point of the Italian peninsula further to the north. The beachheads had withstood the worst that could be thrown at them, and Italy was slowly succumbing to Allied pressure. On the 25th, the Allied forces met up at Ponte Selle, some 15 miles inland. Salerno had cost over 12,500 casualties during the 11 days that the brutal conflict had lasted. Another vital stage, one that is often passed over in the history books, leading to the collapse of the Third Reich, had been reached. By October, 190,000 Allied troops had been landed on the Salerno beaches. On October the 1st, the British had finally entered Naples and brought it under Allied control. They were confronted with a port town wrecked by the Germans. The destruction of Italy was to become even more terrible in the coming months. Churchill was champing at the bit with frustration, complaining that the stagnation on the Italian front is becoming scandalous. It was obvious that another plan had to be found to break the stalemate. When Rommel was withdrawn, Kesselring was appointed as commander of all forces in Italy on the 21st of November. The appointment was significant because it showed that Hitler had changed his mind about Italy. He had thought that a withdrawal to the north would be necessary after Salerno. But the increasingly stuttering nature of the Allied advance gave him new hope that he could hold off their attacks with a prolonged defense. Kesselring determined to hold the Gustav Line for at least 6 months. He was as good as his word. Hitler then promptly pulled the rug from under Kesselring by assigning 4 of the best divisions to the Russian front. The replacements were 3 depleted divisions badly in need of recuperation. At the Tehran conference in November, Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy, had been agreed upon. Italy became very much a secondary consideration, and it was not envisaged that the Balkans should be invaded after the German forces in Italy had been subdued. A front line from Pisa to Rimini was the farthest north that the Allied forces were to advance. A plan originally worked out by General Clark for landings at Anzio, between Rome and the Gustav Line, was now resurrected. Eisenhower had always been reluctant to deploy his troops in Italy, but his attention was on the invasion planned in June on the Normandy beaches. He felt that all his troops should have been reserved for that theatre of war. Not only did the troops in Italy often not have the training that the invasion troops in France had, they were given less supplies than their comrades still waiting in England. By the time the preparations for Operation Overlord were underway, Churchill, a strong supporter of the Anzio plan, now renamed Operation Shingle, began to have shipping and landing craft siphoned off to support the proposed Anzio landings. As the new year of 1944 broke, Operation Shingle had grown into a major, combined British-American offensive. With Eisenhower now in charge of the Normandy operations, Alexander took charge as Supreme Commander in Italy towards the end of 1943, whilst Montgomery, also committed to the Normandy invasion, was replaced by Lieutenant General Sir Oliver Leese. Alexander had designed the Anzio operation well overall, but the time scale meant that the preparations were rushed. On the night of January the 17th to the 18th, 1944, the landings were underway. The British 10th and the American 2nd Corps drew the attention of Kesselring's forces in their attempts at river crossings, which continued dismally until the 22nd, the date set for the landings at Anzio. The landings caught the Germans wrong-footed, and as the American 6th Corps under Major General John P. Lucas stormed ashore in the southern sector and the British landed to the north of Anzio, there was practically no opposition whatever. The Luftwaffe soared into the skies and bore down on the massed men and machines on the sand. Artillery pounded the troops, now hemmed in on all sides. The enormous 250mm railway gun, nicknamed Anzio Annie, headed the list of a variety of weaponry brought in to blast the trapped Allies. The fact that only 6 men from 2 American battalions survived the first day indicates the intensity of the inferno. Over the next days, the Allied troops managed to make a little headway, but succeeded in getting just 7 miles from the coast. Only on the 30th, when some 61,000 troops had been landed, did the first real attempt to press into the hinterland take place. It was swiftly strangled by German defences. Kesselring ordered his counterattack in February. It exploded on the 3rd with a thunderous artillery barrage that heralded wave after wave of armour and infantry attacks. British troops became isolated and lost 1,400 men. The British were forced to withdraw, and when combined British-American counterattacks failed, the beachheads were in danger. As in World War I, a front line emerged that shifted continuously without altering the basic run of the fighting. A pattern of attack followed by counterattack took shape, which became enfeebled with the failure of a German offensive in March. But by then, attention had already shifted to another bitterly fought theatre of war. The Benedictine monastery at Monte Cassino was built in the 6th century high on a hill, and now formed a vital link in the German defensive chain that spanned southern Italy from east to west, the Gustav Line. It stood as a fortress between the Allies and the Italian capital. Once Rome fell, the rest of Italy would follow suit. The plan to take the stronghold went spectacularly awry, leaving a legacy of appalling death and destruction. Battles raged from January until May 1944. Only then was the ruin of a once proud building in Allied hands. The landings in Normandy that took place in the month following the fall of Monte Cassino were of course more newsworthy, more spectacular and of greater import than the fighting for an obscure monastery in Italy. Monte Cassino, just as Salerno and Anzio, became a forgotten battlefield. The agony endured, overshadowed by the events in the north. Around Monte Cassino were strong German defensive lines. The British 8th Army had approached the Gustav Line from the east, with soldiers from Britain, Poland, and many Commonwealth countries. The American 5th Army was to the west of Monte Cassino. The men were to fight and die side by side. The Allies attacked head-on, but were unable to get close because of the ferocious German fire from above. The Americans were the first to try the defences. They had come to within 400 yards of the monastery at one stage, but with 75% losses, the positions were untenable. The stalemate, with its high death rate, continued. These attacks had shown the Germans, who had also lost many men, that reinforcements were urgently needed if the monastery was to be held. The infantry alone could not cope. Elite paratroopers, the Fallschirmjäger, whose reputation as hardened fighters went before them, were hastily brought in. Monte Cassino was ready for one of the most tragic battles that war had to offer. Neither the Germans nor the Allied troops were prepared to give up 1 centimetre of ground. Another war of attrition developed. There was hardly time to mourn lost comrades. The corpses of both sides had to be buried quickly. They were a hazard to the defenders and the attackers. High up on the hill, the German observers were able to guide the artillery shells almost to the centimetre, down onto Allied troops spread over the plains below them. The shelling was constant, the dead were repeatedly hit. Allied shelling into the hill was equally as deadly. To move at all was to dice with death. Snipers, mines and booby traps were always present to finish the work of the artillery. By February 1944, the Allies had got nowhere. The decision was made to make a more concerted assault on the monastery. Commonwealth troops were to be included in this run with death up the hill. General Bernhard Freyberg ordered air support for the attack. A controversial decision, as the Germans claimed to have no troops in the monastery. On the 15th of February, the bombers were in the skies flying from the south. The Germans looked up as the walls of the ancient buildings and the surrounding hillside erupted into flame and coiling turrets of smoke. 450 tons of bombs fell onto the monastery from 229 bombers. Now the Germans had no reason to remain outside the ruins. Smashed walls provided ideal cover for the defenders, who were quick to take advantage. They scrambled into positions in the rubble and waited. The Allied commanders had assumed that once the bombardment had finished, the battle would be over too. A tragic error. The bombing, far from helping them, had worked against them. When the infantry began their assaults the following day, they ran into certain death. The attacks were repulsed with heavy loss of life. Despite the failure of the second assault, Freiburg had to continue planning for the capture of the hill. Another attempt was set for the 15th of March. Troops were to make a two-pronged assault, with some attacking the town of Monte Cassino and the others scaling the slopes of the hill. Tanks would be used as infantry support. Bombers would again be used, this time to pound the defenders in the town. 500 bombers were sent into the skies, and over 1,000 tons of bombs smashed the town to dust, followed by a creeping artillery barrage. As the dust began to settle over the ruins in the town, it was clear that the bombing had again achieved nothing. The German paratroops took up positions in the craters and rubble and waited for the Allied infantry to come in. The German machine guns opened up with support from the troops on the hill. A terrible battle at close quarters developed, in which the Germans had the advantage. The struggle went on throughout March, without regard to the losses which inexorably mounted towards the 4,000 mark. The numbers of wounded were so high that a brief ceasefire took place to allow both sides to collect the dead and injured. By the 24th of March, it was clear that the assault had little chance of success. The losses were becoming inexcusable, and General Freiburg was forced to call off this third assault. Only parts of the town were in Allied hands, as was a ridge halfway between the town and the monastery. The monastery itself seemed as far from capture as ever, despite the Allied shelling. The German guns, with mortars and Nebelwerfer, were lashing troops exposed on the hillside and plain as heavily as ever, smashing the corpses and hurling them through the air. As in France in the First World War, the front line in Italy in 1944 had become immobilized. A new initiative was urgently needed to find a way through the defenses, and it was provided by General Harold Alexander. British 8th Army troops had been positioned at the western wing of the Gustav Line. In secret, they were transferred to the east. The lethal job of storming the monastery fell to the Polish troops. Throughout April, the build-up continued, as Alexander waited for the weather to improve. The Allies would advance along a 20-mile corridor between the coast and the mountain range. Almost in the middle of the line of advance was the monastery at Monte Cassino. At 11 a.m. on May the 11th, 1944, 1,600 Allied artillery guns began to shell the Germans. For 2 hours the guns fired, and the ground vanished beneath smoke and dust. As the shelling stopped, the British, Indian, French and American infantry went forward. The Germans now began to rain fire onto the Allied troops as machine guns and artillery cut down the men struggling through the rivers and into the rubble. Capturing the town of St. Angelo, the Allied troops discovered the massive concrete German bunkers that had been completely unaffected by the Allied shelling, a salutary lesson on the efficiency of the Wehrmacht. Despite the merciless fire descending on them, the Polish were finally making headway in their fight up towards the monastery, and the French forces on the plain below were also able to make good headway. By the 17th of the month, German forces began to retreat from their hilltop positions. As the British also began to make greater advances along the valley, the monastery could no longer be held, and the order to withdraw was issued. The Gustav line finally collapsed. But the order for withdrawal came too late for many of the defenders. The Polish, despite being beaten back many times, finally fought their way up to the ruins. For the remaining German soldiers, the war was over. The welcome sight of the Polish flag flying over the rubble was soon seen by the relieved Allies. Only on May the 18th did the town of Monte Cassino fall into Allied hands. Like the monastery above, it too was a landscape of rubble. One of the most savage battles of the war was over. Alexander had made good his command and paved the way for the liberation of Italy. The Allies turned their full attention to the Anzio troops still hemmed in around the beaches. On the 23rd of May, they opened the breakout offensive with an artillery barrage that lasted 3/4 of an hour over the entire Anzio front. Backed up by airstrikes, Allied armour and infantry breached the German lines and were on the advance for the first time since the January landings. The retreating Germans took heavy losses before the American 6th and 2nd Corps linked up on the 25th of May. General Clark, with one eye on the propaganda newsreels, allowed the German 10th Army to escape to the north of Rome, so that he could get American troops into Rome before the British. For his few hours of glory, the German 10th Army would make sure that the Allied soldiers paid with their lives. On the evening of June the 4th, 1944, Rome was free of its Nazi occupiers. Just hours later, British paratroopers were landing in northern France. Operation Overlord had begun. The fall of Rome, overshadowed by the events in France, did not set Allied morale alight as might have been expected. Italy was still not free. Allied tensions and the Italians' past alliance with Hitler made the capture of the capital somewhat of an anticlimax. The bitter fighting continued as before, with the Germans not conceding an inch until forced. They only fell back to the Trasimeno line just north of Perugia on the 22nd of June. By mid-August, Kesselring had reformed his defences along the Gothic line, 150 miles north of the capital. It stretched from the coast near Masso in the west to Pesaro in the east. Organised in 1943, it was inadequately reinforced, which was why the Germans had been so keen to halt the Allied advance further south. As the Allies approached, feverish work began to strengthen the 200-mile-long line. Anti-tank guns and mortars were supported by some 2,500 machine gun nests, set up in the elevated areas. Artillery was brought in, and the defences reached a depth of 10 to 12 miles by August. The Germans' last stand in Italy was going to be as bloody as any that had gone before. On the 25th of August, the first artillery barrage opened up on the Adriatic eastern side of the line. The Americans did likewise in the west, broke through the initial defences towards Bologna. Throughout September, German actions could not prevent the Allied troops gaining further ground on their thrust north. The Americans, though, were meeting increased opposition that slowed their progress. Losses were creeping up, and 6 Allied divisions had been withdrawn from Italy to take part in the invasion of southern France, Operation Anvil, with landings on the beaches there. With Allied numbers in Italy considerably weakened by Anvil, the weather began to break. Slogging through the snow, sleet and mud, the British managed to get to Ravenna before the winter forced hostilities to an end. German-Italian forces had made life difficult for the Americans briefly, but new Allied troops were arriving to bolster the final push through the northern Italian plains. Fate now took a hand in the Allies' favour. Kesselring was injured in a car accident and left for Germany. He eventually took part in the defence of the Western Front in France. General Heinrich von Vietinghoff replaced him. Alexander was given overall command of the Mediterranean theatre of war and set about preparing for a powerful offensive in the spring of 1945. The winter was heavy, and a resumption of the fighting could only be contemplated once April arrived. The Allies opened the 1945 campaign with an attack intended to distract the Germans from their true intentions. These became clear on the 9th of April, when they launched a full-scale assault into the Argente area north of Ravenna. A massive raid by 1,800 bombers and fighter bombers released 300 tons of bombs, followed by artillery shelling. The infantry came on behind, and von Vietinghoff was unable to check the advance despite the usual unyielding defense given by his men. The Americans were prevented by the weather from getting back into action until the 14th. By the 19th, the first of their exploitation forces were entering the plains of the Po. Vietinghoff realized that he had no hope of holding the lines. He had already made an appeal to Hitler for an elastic withdrawal of his troops, retreating in sections from river to river. His request was refused. Just before the American offensive began, he made another attempt to have a withdrawal to the Po authorized, with the same result. On the 20th, he took the decision himself. He had left it too late. The Allies were sweeping into the plains and gathering up the German forces. Italian partisans increased their activity, and fate gave them the prize they most desired. Mussolini, dressed in a German overcoat, was trying to escape by car to Germany. A band of partisans stopped the car near Lake Como and hauled him and his mistress out. He was executed. It was April the 28th, 1945. Hitler was shaken by the news. If he had deceived himself until then, he had no doubt what awaited him should he fall into the hands of his enemies. By the end of the month, he had followed his erstwhile ally into a miserable death. One day later, an unconditional surrender had been agreed to come into force at 12 noon on May the 2nd. For Italy, the fascist nightmare had ended. The Italian victory may not have enjoyed the kudos lent to other theatres of war, and the battles lost their grim outlines as the great joy at the war's ending unfolded. But there is no doubt that alongside their comrades who fought in France, in Germany, North Africa and elsewhere, are the combatants who earned their honourable place in the history of World War II during the bitter fighting of the war in Italy.